Welcome to Lesson 22 in a C# from start to finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to get started on the tournament viewer form. I decided to break this form up into a couple parts so we can make each part smaller. Today, we're going to wire up all the fields, but we won't be saving any of the data to the database or the text files. We'll leave that for next lesson. Let's get started. Here is our tournament viewer form. And what this does is it displays our tournament name, the number of rounds we have, and when we select a round, it's going to display the matchups for that round. If we check this box, then we'll only see the games or the matchups that have not yet been played, which will mean this list will get smaller and smaller as we play games. When we select a matchup in this list, Team 1's name should populate over here, Team 2's name should populate down here, and then a score for each should be filled in starting at 0, but then we can change this by filling in the values and hitting score. Now, we'll do all the way through a score button, but we won't actually save the data anywhere. It'll just be on the form itself that we make the changes. So let's start by figuring out where we get the tournament object from. And I think that's pretty straightforward. We've done it before. We need to pass that in to our tournament viewer form. Essentially what we're saying is we don't know which tournament you want. This is not a tournament lookup form. That would be the dashboard. The dashboard, we find all the tournaments and say which one do you want. The tournament viewer form just views a tournament. Therefore, let's pass in tournament model and do control dot and add the using statement. We'll call it tournament model. And then up here outside of our constructor, we will say private tournament model. Tournament equals, well, let's not do equals yet. We'll do that in the constructor. So tournament equals tournament model. And that's a lowercase t. So we pass in this tournament model object called tournament model. Notice the lowercase t versus the uppercase t allows us to differentiate between the class name and the parameter name. And we do have case-sensitive C#. You should be familiar with that by now. So we pass in the tournament model as a parameter whenever we construct a new tournament viewer form. The first thing we do in the constructor is we take that model and we store it into a private variable at the form level, which means that anything on the form can have access then to this tournament object. The next thing we want to do is we want to actually create a private void set up, let's call it load form data. Load form data. And what this is going to do is take this tournament object and it's going to populate the information we need. For example, this right here is called tournament name. So we can say tournament name dot text equals tournament dot tournament name. So we're taking the value from the instance, we're grabbing the property tournament name and putting that into our text box, actually a label, on the form, putting in the text value. So they should say which one we're using. Now let's call this method. We've only done one thing so far. That's okay. We'll call this method right after we accept the tournament model. And now we can go and fix the tournament dashboard form, because we'll have a problem here. And actually won't have a problem yet because we haven't actually even called this yet. So load tournament. In here, we need to call the tournament viewer form. Tournament viewer form, FRM, equals new tournament viewer form, but it's going to ask for a tournament model. We don't have that yet. How do we get that? Well, we're going to take whatever is selected in this box. So we're going to say tournament model TM equals, and we're going to get the drop down, so we need to find the name of that. I always forget it. It's load existing tournament dropdown. Load existing tournament dropdown dot selected item. And we need to cast that to tournament model. So we're going to take whatever is selected here, make sure that we convert it over to a tournament model, and then we're going to pass that into the viewer form. And then finally, we're going to say frm.show. So that modification, this button is now wired up to call this form, and this form is wired up to change this label to have the tournament name. Let's hit start and see if this works. Let's pull over our form. So we have first tourney and second tourney. Let's grab the first one and say load tournament. And this pops up. Tournament, first tourney. Notice the matching names here. So we've got a winner. We actually have things wired up properly. Now let's continue on with wiring up this form. Now so far I picked the easy one because that's just let's call it load rounds, that's fine. And then up here, we're going to create a list of string. We're going to call this rounds equals new list of string. So this will be what we wire up to our dropdown. And it's just a list of string. And actually, let's make this a list of int. Make our lives a little easier. And I'll explain why. So this list of rounds, whatever it is going to populate this dropdown. Now, if we have a list of int or a list of string, it's very easy to populate this list because it just grabs a value and does a toString and puts it in this box. If we put a int in here, then we can grab that back out as an int, and then we know this is the round that we need. If we have a string, we have to do a conversion on that, especially if we say in the dropdown, instead of just 1 or 2, if we say round 1, round 2, in which case we have to take off first the round space and then grab just the number and then convert that. We could do that. It's a little more complicated, but it'd work. Another thing we could do is we could create a model, and the model would have a string representation for the round name, but it'd also have in there a list of matchup. And then we could grab that immediately and use it. We could do that and maybe come back to that at some point and say, yeah, I want to do that. But for now, let's just go the easy route, the simple route, and say we're going to have a drop down that has 1, 2, 3, or in our case, for example, 1 and 2 for the 2 rounds. And we'll call this matchups, sorry. And we'll create the appropriate closing angle bracket. So in here, we now have a list of our matchups. These are each of our rounds. And we're going to say if matchups dot first dot matchup round is greater than current round. This look familiar? We've done something similar before, but in this case we're looping through just our list of matchups. So basically each round is all we're looping through. We're not looping through each value inside matchups. But we're taking the first value inside matchups and we're saying, what's the round that you have? Well, the first one is matchup round. And that's going to say 1. And so we already have a 1. We've added it already. But once we get to 2, then we're going to say is rounds.add. And we'll put the new round in. And we could say current round plus 1. We could add the current round first. Or we can grab the actual value, which I kind of like grab the value, even though it's the same as the current round plus 1. I just like having the actual value in case anything were to happen. It's weird, I know, but I like to have that. So, actually what we can do, let's change this. Cur round equals the round, since it's different, and then we'll put cur round here. All right, that makes you feel a little better. So we're going to start off with a 1 for the first round, and we'll add that to the rounds list. But then if the current set of matchups, if the first value's matchup round is greater than the current round, the first time through being 1, so if it's a 2, then take that value, put it into our current round. So now current round is 2. Add that value to the rounds list and loop through again. And it should be that we have a value entered for every single round we have. And now once we're done all of this, then we can make sure that we connect this dropdown. And this dropdown is called round dropdown. So let's create another private method. And we will say that the round dropdown dot data source, we're going to start off at null. So we'll wipe it out if there's a value already there. And then we'll say round dropdown dot data source equals rounds. And then we will say we don't even have to give it the display member because it's just going to display the actual value to string, which is great. So we'll call this wire up lists after we change the rounds. So after we've updated the rounds to have the correct values. And the other thing here is let's make sure that we initialize the rounds every time. Otherwise, what could happen is if for whatever reason we run this twice, if we don't initialize the list to a new list, we'll have duplicate rounds, and that's not right. So we'll start off from fresh every time and add the rounds all over again. Again, let's start this and make sure that this part works. First tourney, load tournament, and we have nothing in our dropdown. No worries. We'll figure out why. And if you're astute, you have already noticed that I never called load rounds. Let's put our breakpoint there. We'll call load tournament again. After load form data, let's say load rounds. We'll hit continue. And now we pop up with this form, the first tourney. We have 1 already selected, and we also have 2. There's our rounds. Now we should populate this list. Now that list should be populated based upon a change in the value here. So let's go over to our properties window. Let's first stop this. Let's go to our properties window. I'm actually going to pin this. And for this drop down, I'm going to go over here to my events, change to events. And if you notice, the selected index changed is the default event. That's what I want. So in the right-hand side over here, I'm going to double click and it created the event for me. Now every time that we change which item is selected in this dropdown, it will fire that event and we can update this matchup list box. Now I'm actually going to call a private method. How'd you guess? I love private methods. Private void load matchup list. Actually, let's call it load matchups so it can be similar to load rounds. So load matchups. We'll call that from our dropdown. And let's not worry about passing anything in. We'll over here in our load matchups, the very first thing we're going to do is grab the value of our dropdown. So we're going to say int round equals, or cast to int the round dropdown dot selected item. Because selected item is an object, but we know it's an integer, therefore we can cast it to an integer, just like we do in other areas when we cast it to our model. So now we have the round we need. And now we can loop through our tournaments. Let's loop through our tournament rounds, I'm sorry. I'm just going to copy that code and paste in here, because we're already doing that up here in our load rounds. We loop through our tournament rounds. But this time, instead of seeing, is it different, we're going to say, is the first matchup round equal to our round that we want? If it is, then we're going to do something with that value. And what are we going to do with that value? Well, up here at the very top, we're going to have another list, a list of matchup model. We'll call it matchups equals new list of matchup models. And I believe it actually will cause a conflict. Yes, it will. So let's call it something different. Let's call it the selected matchups. All right. So we're going to have the selected matchups. And this will be what we have for our matchup listbox.dataSource equals selected matchups. And we'll actually set it to null first. And then we'll also set our display member equal to something. And we'll come back to that in just a minute. But first, we need to come down here and actually set our selected matchups equals matchups. And where do we get that matchups from? Well, that's what we're looping through. We're looping through each round in our tournament. And we find a round that has the first entry has a matchup round equal to the round we want. We grab all the matchups, we grab all of them, and put them into our selected matchups. And the last thing we would do is call our wire up lists. So the only thing we have left to do then is come back up here and change the display member for our list box. Well, let's look at the matchup model. By the way, if you haven't been following along or didn't catch what I said before, whenever you select an item, an object, and hit F12, that goes to definition. And that's a really quick way to get where you need to go. So here I want to say, what is the matchup? How do I display this matchup? And that's kind of hard because there's not really a good value. There's an ID, that doesn't really help anything. There's a winner ID, doesn't help. There's the winner, well, we don't know if there is a winner yet. There's the matchup round, don't really care, we know what that is already. So therefore, we're left with entries, which is a list of matchup entry model. Not helpful. So let's actually create a new public string display name. No parens. We have a curly braces because this is a property. We have a get, but no set. And so what this get is going to do is it's going to figure out, based upon the entries in the matchup entry model, what the name should be. And so the ID would be that the team name would be team name space VS period space the other team name. So let's do this. For each matchup entry model, ME in entries. And we'll create a string output equals empty string. And then we're going to say for each entry here, if output.length equals 0. So what I'm doing here is checking the same value? Well, we're looping through each entry in our list of entries. Our list of entries are up here. So if we have one entry, it's going to come down here and say, okay, the first entry, output length is 0 because we have it set to empty string to start with. Therefore, the output is going to be the team name. So think about the bye week. With bye week, we only have one team in a matchup. Therefore, the bye week would just have a team name. Whereas, if we have two teams, after it does this and sets the output, it's going to loop through for the next team and say, nope, the output length is not equal to 0, therefore I call this. So I have team name over here, and that's going to be space versus space and the other team name. And now we can return all of this. And this is a read-only property now we can have access to. Copy this value, save our model, come back over here to the display member and paste in display name. Let's see this work. I will select our tournament. And notice already we have uncanny losers in the first entry and team first place versus Sue's team in the second entry. Round number 2, we're going to have an issue. I can't select round number 2. We have a bug that causes a problem. So let's see what that problem is before we go any further. I think I have an idea of what that is, because when we select round number 2, what it's going to say is, oh, wait, I don't have any team names. So what do? And it's going to throw an error. So that's my guess. Let's go over to our matchup model and actually put a breakpoint at the very beginning here, and then try to change our round to round number 2. Excellent, we get there. And it says there's one entry, and it says the team competing. There's 2 of them. Nope, this is still round 1. We run again, entries 2. This is still round 1. But now we have entries 2 with a team competing of Sue's team and team first place. That's still round 1. Entries of 1. Team competing 2. It's the uncanny losers. So we've got some kind of issue here we got to figure out, because that shouldn't be what it's doing. So let's take a step back and go to where we're actually changing this in the event. And that's down here where we say load matchups. Now let's fire off this event and change this to 2. And we're going to go right to the load matchups. And the very first thing we're going to do is find a selected item. And if we see here, dropdown.selected item equals 2. So the round is going to be 2. And yes, it in fact is. And now we're going to loop through all of our rounds. And in round 2, we should find this object. But notice we have this display name error. I'm wondering if that's going to cause us a problem even though we don't actually throw an error. But let's see. It's going to say for the first round items, do we have a match on the round number? So the first, I'm going to say matchup round, that's 1. Does 1 equal 2? Nope. Therefore, we're going to go to the next one and say, does the matchup for this, does its round, which is 2, equal 2? And it does. Therefore, we go to selected matchups equals this list. We're going to wire up the lists. and immediately we fire this event again that says load matchups. So we have another issue. Let's actually stop this right now because we found two issues now. The next issue is that we are recalling this list because we are refreshing both the drop-down and the matchup list box. So let's here. Oops. There we go. And the rounds is right there. So now that should fix problem number 1. Problem number 2 is our model, where we say give us the team name, but sometimes the team competing is null. So what we need to do is we need to wrap all of this in a surround with if me.team competing is not equal to null. Otherwise, we get all the way to the end and our display name will be whatever we started with. But actually, let's change this to say else output equals matchup not yet determined. And that's because you're in a round where we don't know the winners of the previous round yet, so we can't determine what the matchup is. So if we have a problem like that, we'll just say matchup not yet determined. Now there may be two teams competing, which is going to be a problem here. And so what we need to do is we need to break out of this for each loop. Otherwise, we'll have matchup not yet determined twice. And that's not what we want. So let's do a break. And that way, if we encounter a team where we have a null value, we're going to say matchup not yet determined. That means even if it's the second team that we don't know yet, we'll still say matchup not yet determined. We may know one team, we don't know both teams. So we'll wait to determine who that's going to be. So that should fix that other problem, but let's see if it actually does. Always test your assumptions. So we have round 1, that's cool. Round 2, matchup not yet determined. Excellent. Round 1, uncanny losers, team first place versus Sue's team. Perfect. Now, let's modify it so that whenever the value here changes, we update team 1, team 2 to be actual team names, and the scores to have the actual score values if there are any. And then we can wire the score button after that. So let's start off by just saying, whoever selected here, update this information. So let's go back to our code behind. Let's actually close out these other things. I like having an uncluttered workspace up top. And I'll unpin this as well. I'll unpin this. Okay, so now what we want to do is whenever this value changes, which one selected, we want to populate this information. So let's go to our properties for the matchup list box. Selected index changed. Double click in the what is a black space for me, or almost black. double click here and create the event. Now we can create another method. Now this method might be a little bit close to the other one for your taste, but I'm going to call it private void load matchup, singular. Notice right up here we have load matchups, plural. So if that's too close for you, feel free to rename it. But I like the symmetry of having load matchups, which is a list of matchups, versus load matchup, which is one matchup. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say matchup model M equals matchup model. And this is the matchup list box dot selected item. So that grabs the selected item and says, okay, that's a matchup, therefore give me that model. And by the way, we need to call this method from our event. I could put all the logic right inside the event, but if I did so, then I can't call the logic again without calling the events method, and that means I have to pass in an object and an event args. And I can do that by kind of faking it, but that's just ugly. So instead, I create a separate method and call that method. That way I can call it again from other places and not have to worry about calling an actual event signature. So now we're going to do a for loop for I equals 0. I is less than m dot entries dot count. Now, why am I not doing a for each loop? Well, the difference is in a for loop, I have the int I, which I can use to determine is this the first one or the second one, which is important because if you notice, I have team 1 and I have team 2. So if I equals 0, then I can do something. Now I could ignore the for loop, not put it in there, and just do a m.entries with a position 0 and 1 for position 1. The problem is I then have to do a check to make sure there's 2 entries. Remember that for our first matchup, we have a bye week. There's only 1 entry. Therefore, it'd throw an error when we try to reach entry number 2 in that matchup. So this way, the for loop, it will loop through the entries however many there are. 0, 1, 2. And I only care about 1, well, actually 0 and 1. So therefore, if I do more than 2, it's not going to do anything. And if I do less than 2, it will just take care of the first one. So if I equals 0, let's grab these properties. This property name is team1 name. And this is probably team1 score. Yep. So team1 name and team1 score value. Team1 name dot text equals m.entries at array position 0 dot team competing dot team name. Now you may have already realized we're going to have a problem here or a bug here if the team competing is null. So we'll surround this with an if statement. If m.entries at 0 team competing is not equal to null. Otherwise, we have to do something. Team1 name.text equals not yet set. Now we also need to get a score. So we're going to say the team1 score value dot text equals m.entries position 0 dot score. And you have to do a .toString on that because score is a double. And you cannot just put a double into a string. You have to convert it to a string, which this method toString does for us. Now, if a team is not yet set, what should the score be? It should probably be just blank, I would assume. Not even 0. So let's just put it at blank. So that's for position 1. We can just copy this and do it for position 2, well, a second position, which is I equals 1. Change this to say value. Consistency is key. All right. So back over here, those should now work. And now, whenever we select a different matchup, we're going to come in here and populate the values for our matchup. Let's see if this works. Our first tourney will load the tournament. And we have the uncanny losers. Now here's an issue. The uncanny losers is playing against the bye week. But we don't actually have a value for team 2. That's kind of a problem. So we'll have to fix that for when our loop only goes through 1. But down here, team first place versus Sue's team, the scores are correct. If we change to round 2, interestingly enough, we don't change this list yet, but these do say not yet set, which is correct. So we got to figure out, we got a bug here somewhere with our update where it's not yet showing us the new values for our list. So let's close this out. Close this out. Let's address the easier of the 2 bugs first of all. And that is if we have a bye week, we don't get through to this second if statement. There's only one entry. Therefore, we never hit this. Therefore, we don't even put not yet set. We put nothing. So let's change that so that if we get through the first set, we'll also set the second set. So we'll say team 2 name equals, and we'll put in brackets BYE for bye. And the value for the score is 0. So that should solve the first problem. Now let's look at the second problem. The second problem is when the drop-down selected index changes. The round drop-down, we load the matchups. So what does load matchups do? Well, it come down here. The first thing it does is it says, give me the round that you're in, find the matchups that if it matches, and then put those matchups in the selected matchups. Okay, so it just grabs the whatever round we're in, grabs all those matchups and puts them in selected matchups. Then it says wire up the matchup list. So that sets the matchups display list. So it seems like that should work. I'm not sure why it's not working. But let's look at this wire up. Let's look at the rounds list. Rounds changes, round dropdown. We load the matchups. After we load the matchups, we change the wire up matchups list box. So it seems like it should work. So we got to figure out why that's not working. And we'll get to that in a minute. Let's first load our tournament and see that Uncanny Losers now is versus the bye. And Sue's team versus team first place works. We can switch back and forth. That's not a problem. We switch to round 2. And we get nothing. And why is that? So let's figure that out. Since this kind of breaks the form, let's actually close it out and reload it. Now it's working correctly because we have not yet changed the round. Let's find out what happens when we do change the round. So we'll put our breakpoint at load matchups, grab our form again and say change the round. It hits this, that's great. We find the round that it is. We find the matching matchup, which is second one. And now selected matchups should have a count of 1. And it does. It has 1 item in our selected matchups. And selected matchups is this right here. So therefore, selected matchups has 1 entry. We go now to the wire up the matchup list. We take the list box. We set the data source to null. Now we take the selected matchups, which has 1 matchup. And it says the display name is matchup not yet determined. That's okay. And we say show that and set the display name as what you should show. And now we're going to run again the drop-down selected index changed. That's interesting. We're running it twice. Let's find out why. Oops, I'm sorry. We're not running it twice. We are just we're finishing up that method. But yet somehow our list has not yet updated or refreshed. Now this is a real head scratcher. And part of this has to do with the fact that the way that list boxes, the binding works, is a little clunky. I mean, setting it to null and setting it back is a clunky way of doing things. Now I could do a binding list, but that introduces other problems. So let's start debugging by figuring out what happens when we select an item in our matchup. Now we have that matchup list box selected index change. So let's grab that and change our index. And it does change. So let's first step into this code and find out the selected item where it says matchup not yet determined. That's the one selected. So it knows about the new model. And we should be able to populate all this information. And if we hit continue, it says not yet set, not yet set. So it knows at least what the values are in this list. We can keep doing this. And say selected item. It's got it. Hit continue. And so it knows every time I switch what the values are, but yet the display has not yet been updated. So we've got an issue in here where we're not actually updating our list box. We're not refreshing our list box. Now just to test it a little bit further, if we change to round 1 and we look, the selected item for round is round 1. That's great. And we should go wire up our matchup list. So let's go through all of this. And it's going to say, okay, now we need to wire up our data source for matchups. And our selected items is 2. That's correct. And the original 2. And so now we set our data source to be null. Then we set our data source to be selected matchups. Set the display member. And now we're done with that. Our matchups, so we'd call it matchups binding equals new binding source. And then when we actually wired things up, we wouldn't wire directly to our list. Instead, what we'd do is we would say rounds binding dot data source equals rounds. And then we'd say the drop down, its data source is the binding. And so there's that two-part connection there where we're connecting to the binding source in the middle. So on one side is our drop down, on the other side is our list, and in the middle between the two is our binding. So we do that, and let's do the same thing for matchups, just so we have everything set. And so we'd say matchup binding. What's our matchup binding called? Matchups binding dot data source equals selected matchups. And then our binding source is the data source for our list box. We keep the display member as it is. So that's what we used to do. But then anytime we called these two, instead of doing a wire up rounds list, what we'd say is source in the middle will help our issue. So we're going to run this again. And now we have nothing here. Excellent. So we've got some kind of issue we have to take care of first, because our tournament comes out as blank even though we have the first tourney in the tournament name. So we didn't do something quite right with our binding source. So we have our rounds binding and matchup binding. And once we load the rounds, right here, we have this load rounds. We should load the rounds up, and we do need to, at that point, wire up our rounds list. Or, short of that, what we can do is in our constructor, we can wire up the rounds list. And wire up the matchup list. So that's like the constructor. The first time you set it up, you configure the binding, but after that, instead of setting it to null, what you do is you do a reset binding. Let's run this again and say load tournament, and we still have nothing for our list. So we got something still kind of nagging at us. Let's find out what that is. And so after looking at this a little harder, I'm still not getting this to work the way I want. Now, I could keep fighting with binding source, but I do know that's the old way of doing things. And I don't want to keep doing the old way of doing things. And there is a better way going forward, kind of. And that's the idea of binding list. Now, you can bind directly to a binding list, and things work great. So whenever you refresh data, it gets updated automatically, and you don't have to do any calls to refresh the data. The only problem with this is we can at least eliminate the idea of wiring up our data sources, or at least mostly eliminate that. So we'll get back to this in a minute, and we'll change this to a binding list. And we don't need to do resets. And so now we have only a few errors left, but one of the errors is this right here. Selected matchup, which is a binding list, equals matchups. Well, we can't convert a list to a binding list. Essentially, we need to convert every one of our lists to a binding list instead whenever we're using it as a binding list. Fortunately, this is not too hard. We can say equals new binding list of matchup model, and then pass in an I list, which list is an I list. Remember, I in front of something usually means interface. In this case, it does. List implements the interface I list. So therefore, we can pass in this list to the new constructor. So new binding list, pass in a list, it will populate then the selected matchups. So that should work for that. And if we scroll up here, then we don't really need to do much with our bindings, except make sure that we have our rounds going into our data source. I'm sorry, our dropdown. So we can just say, there is our rounds, goes right into our combo box. And then also we have our list right here, which goes right into our list box. We can get rid of this, and we'll still set display member like that. So now we should have a binding list for everything, and we shouldn't have any errors. A quick way to tell if you have errors is to open up Solution Explorer, look for the red squiggly underneath your file that you're in, and that should tell you pretty quickly. Or you can look on the right here in this bar, which gets kind of cluttered, but in here if you see anything red, you can move to that. So again, this is an experiment. Let's see if this works, and if it does, we'll clean up our code. We load, and now we have nothing again. So that didn't work. So now we're at the point where we've made code change after code change, and we're kind of getting our code cluttered up. So let's first of all figure out if there's anything we can do to debug this first, and then we'll worry about cleaning up our code. So let's put our breakpoint right here. We'll say load tournament, and it comes right to here. Our selected matchups has nothing in it, and our rounds has nothing in it. And we say the round dropdown dot data source equals rounds. And now it has a data source with a count of 0. That's great. The matchups, the data source currently is null for the list box. We're going to put into it the selected matchups, which is 0 in it, and set the display member. Now we need to load form data. Well, that's just the text name of the tournament name. Now we load the rounds. Now rounds, which goes into a round dropdown, we're going to set to a new binding list of int. We're going to add 1 to it. So now rounds has 1 item in it. And then for each other round besides round 1, we're going to add that round as well to our rounds. So now we have 1 and 2. And now our rounds has 2 values, 1 and 2, and it should be that we're all wired up. If we mouse over the rounds dropdown dot data source, we can see that nope, it still has 0. So something's not right with the display there because it's not actually showing us what we want. It's not actually binding the list and keeping that bound. Let's figure out why. So this is where a little bit of guesswork comes in and a little bit of intuition, maybe some Googling. Look on Stack Overflow to find out some solutions. But I have an idea. And that idea is this. We do this rounds equals new binding list of int. What if we didn't do that? You see, when we set a new binding list, maybe it disconnects. So instead, let's see if we can do rounds dot clear. And that should remove all the elements instead. So instead of a new list, we'll reset the elements. And then we have to come down here and look and, well, let's just start with rounds. That's the only place we change rounds. Let's see if that works for rounds. And if it does, we'll apply the same methodology for the matchups. And let's take our breakpoints out. And now we see that rounds, we have 2. So that is the issue. We cannot set the value to be null or new list. We can't say new list, otherwise we have a problem. So we can't do that, but we can clear out the list. Which also means that whenever we come down here, we can't do this. So how do we put the matchups in the binding list? Well, it's be a little bit more complex. And this is why I'm not a big fan of binding lists, but okay. It's what it is. It is what it is. So selected matchups dot clear. So that gets rid of all the items currently in there. And then for each matchup and matchup model M, we don't have M in this current context, that's good. M in matchups. Selected matchups dot add M. So now we're adding that item in one by one after we've cleared it out. So that should solve our problem, we hope. Let's try it again. Load tournament. And we still have a blank list. But now we have one item, and now we have both. So what's the issue here? Well, the issue is we're not actually calling these all the places we need to. So let's figure this out first. All right, so let's first of all clean up what we have. We've got a whole lot of code in here that's not needed or not named well or whatever. And so let's just clean up the stuff that we were messing around with, and let's reset our flow here for our constructor. So our flow here is we need to wire up the rounds list and the matchup list. And that's just these 3 lines. So I'm just going to say wire up lists and go back to that. And I'm going to move this code into here. And I will call wire up matchup lists, or wire up lists right there. We load the tournament model, we immediately wire up our lists. Now, that means we shouldn't have any other errors here because we're not calling that anywhere else. But now we go to load form data, and that's just this form data here. Then we load the rounds. Well, the rounds loads up our rounds list with all the rounds that we have. And that works. So that's great. But what we don't do is we don't select the first round in any way. Now what's not happening here is we're not actually selecting loading the matchups. I think the issue here is that we're loading our rounds, but we're not firing that selected index change by loading those values. We can test this by putting the breakpoint right here and loading our application to see if anything happens when we hit this spot. And in fact, no, this was never fired. So in order for us to fire this, we actually have to manually change the value. Well, that's not ideal. So instead, let's do this. Let's move this logic. I'm going to copy it for now. I'm going to paste it into the load matchup. And I'm going to take an int round in our load matchup. And here's why. Now I can call this at the very end. I can call load matchups, sorry, plural, and pass in a round of 1. We always have the first round, and that's always the first one on the list. And that's right here. So therefore, as soon as you load all the rounds, make sure to load the matchups for round 1. Before we go any further, let's make sure we test this. We hit load tournament, and now we have the selected list actually selected. If we change to 2, that works. If we change back to 1, that works. Now note though, when I changed to 2, the matchup has not yet been determined, and yet the values over here are still uncanny, loser, and bye. But yeah, if I switch them manually, they seem to work. So we have a same issue here where we're not actually selecting the first value. So when the load matchup happens, that's where we populate the information. Let's do the exact same thing. Let's first of all grab the matchup model, and we'll call it M. And we're going to pass it in from the event like this. And that event's down here. So we'll pass it in from the event like that. That way, when we load the matchups, after we're done loading the matchups, which is where we load them all, but we don't actually select one, we're going to call load matchup. And we're going to say matchups dot, not selected matchups. We're going to say, Yes, selected matchups. Dot first. So that's the first matchup in our list. Let's try this again. We have our first tourney. We hit load tournament. And now it's uncanny losers and bye. That's great. We switch to round 2, and it's not yet set and not yet set. Back to round 1, it switches back. So we do have that now updating like we expected. All right, so there's a little bit of debugging there, a couple of issues that cropped up, but that's really all we needed to do. We load this list, we load this list, we wired the two together, and we displayed the information based on which item was selected over in the matchup list box. Now, the unplayed only checkbox has not been dealt with yet, and the score button has not been dealt with yet. We're going to put those into the second video because when we score, we're going to mark an item as played. I'll mark a list, a matchup list. I'm sorry, a matchup. And so when you say score, the matchup will get marked as played, and therefore we'll see if this checkbox works. We'll actually have data to work with. And so we'll do the score and the unplayed only checkbox in the next video. And then we'll move on to actually saving the data once we've changed it. All right, so that's for the next video. Stick around for it.